let's talk about the evolution of recording drums. Here we go. This is yet going to be another post that is a little delicate. When drums were first being recorded, they were in the background. We're talking like swing band era, 1920s, a little before swing band, and going through the 30s, 40s. They were still predominantly in the background. Mics were far away. Even in the studio, you might have had a bass drum mic and an overhead. That was pretty much it. And so a lot of drum recordings don't really give merit to what is going on the drums. You hear a wonderful, however, room sound of the drums. And so what does that mean? That means that there's actually quite a lot of notes going by that you don't really hear because it gets lost in the overall mix. This is a time when things were recorded on tape, and vocals were very much in front of everything else, and the drums were perceived, I think, as they should be, already loud enough to not have them mic'd all over the place. And so you have that perspective of where the drums sit in the recording being behind everybody else. Kind of like the motor in a car. You don't see it, but you hear it. And that perspective pretty much goes through, with the exception of jazz, a little bit, it pretty much goes through that approach through Motown music, soul music. The drums they start to be mic'd more, but there's still a kind of cautious placement of where those notes are in the mix. And even in Motown music, when they obviously had enough engineering awareness to mic the drums and to push them further in the mix, they still pretty much stay behind everybody else. And so notes are still not lost as much, but you still get a sense of not hearing everything that's going on, and that you have to kind of squint your ears to hear the subtleties in snare work, in bass drum work, in hi-hat work. So especially in toms. Toms becoming the part of the instrument mic'd up probably in the last part of the instrument mic'd up properly in the evolution of miking drums. When you get into, I skipped ahead a little bit because in jazz music, where the artistry was defended as it should have been in Motown and soul music, but you have the intellectual defense of jazz musicians and jazz drummers saying, hey, could you please mic up my drums? I'm playing a lot of really cool and I'd like that to be heard. So you do have, incidentally, a better miking of drums in jazz during the 50s, during the late 40s. Jazz drumming has always been, after you get past the swing era, when it starts to promote trios and quartets in the studio, the recordings of the drums are very, very present. Tom work, cymbal work, bass drum work, they're very clean and properly mixed, so you can hear everything that's going on. And there was a lot of notes in bebop music, the phrasings of Kenny Clarke. You can hear all of that stuff. So it's interesting to see how jazz mixing of the drums was ahead of the approaches that they used in Motown music and in soul music of the same period. Even going back to Hal Blaine and the Beach Boys, for example, the mixing and the positioning of his drums is very, very well done, and we get a very good sense of all the notes he's playing. Being a jazz drummer as well, he got a lot of rap for playing all of that heavy music at the time from jazz drummers. You know, why are you doing this and all that? Regardless, I think he was able to defend the notes that he was playing and why they needed to be heard in those wonderful recordings. The Beach Boys just released a few years ago a double CD where you hear several different mixes of the same music without vocals in stereo and then in mono and then with vocals. So you can really hear the placements of all of the instruments and how the mix was happening. And it should be noted that at that time, fading in parts and fading out parts was not automatic. So you had to sit there and re-record everything onto tape, fading in and fading out as the song progressed. And I remember Steve Lukather saying when they were doing, even right up to the 80s, Toto stuff, Michael Jackson stuff, where the mixing session was actually an event where the musicians were informed as to when to fade and when to fade out things, for example, to get a proper mix. Nothing was automated. So that's a side note. But drums start to be very, very present. And we start to hear all of the notes that are being played on the drums, starting putting aside the whole jazz issue, because we were already hearing it in bebop, but in popular music, starting with funk and then going into the funk and the rock of the 70s, and then takes off into the 80s, and it's definitely there. Interestingly so, in the funk era, um, the recording of the toms, of the bass drum, of the snare drum, of the hi-hats, of the cymbals, of percussion was definitely present, but you can find a plethora of funk music where it's too loud, where the notes being played sound saturated and dissonant, distorted. And sometimes it lends itself to a really, really warm and funky effect. I have an album, a compilation of old funk called Saturday Night Fish Fry. And it's one of my favorite funk albums, compilations. But the sounds of the drums are completely saturated and completely overwhelmed the tape. So it should also be noted that when you're playing funk music and soul music, you might be hitting the snare drum and the bass drum and the cymbals louder than you normally would in a jazz song. So I imagine the engineers had to reevaluate the levels that they were used to with jazz music and classical and everything else pre-soul, funk, Motown, and maybe even adjusted the mics they used, swapping ones out for others that could handle, the crack and the power of these funk drummers and soul drummers. When you hear a lot of, for example, Otis Redding, a lot of those drums sound saturated, if not saturated, right on the line. And it lends itself to a really wonderful kind of burning engine of drum sound behind Otis Redding, and Otis's voice only complemented that. So that goes to say that sometimes the mistakes or as the industry's evolving through or adapting through recording techniques, they discover certain things like saturation on tape, getting the needle into the red, on the snare drum, on the bass drum, lends itself to a very complementary sound in certain styles, like funk and soul, and Motown. Absolutely. There are tons of songs in Motown where you hear the needles in red. Now, getting, especially in rock, I should absolutely mention for me, the three iconic rock bands, The Who, Led Zeppelin, and Jimi Hendrix, notably with Mitch Mitchell, right? Those rock bands, this is all post Cream and the Yardbirds and all of that stuff. When it gets to Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin, and The Who, you get a sense that the engineers are really starting to get a grasp on how to mic toms, on how to mic cymbals, snare drums, bass drums, floor toms, hi-hats, cowbells, in a really energetic environment like Led Zeppelin, like The Who. Now, one of the things that I found always kind of tragic, absolutely love Mitch Mitchell. I love the guy. I love how he plays. However, the recordings of Jimi Hendrix don't lend themselves to a cleanliness, dare I say, as much as Led Zeppelin recordings. So there's a lot of saturation on those drums. There's a lot of distortion, and it lends itself to a very different kind of listening experience. Whereas Led Zeppelin and The Who, you had an engineering technique going on where things were properly spaced and where saturation was definitely controlled in a better manner. When you get to Jimi Hendrix stuff, even on record, everything, it's almost as if maybe the techniques of Motown and soul music were being used to record Hendrix stuff, and so the drums sound, they always sound like they're about to crack and explode in his music, just out of sheer power. So most of the time when I go back and listen to Jimi Hendrix stuff, I mean, I love all of it, but I find myself wishing that it was recorded more like Led Zeppelin and The Who. I think if it was, it would have made more of a shock, of a presence in drummers' minds. Mitch Mitchell has kind of is less talked about than John Bonham or Keith Moon, I think, because of it. But with any drummer with ears goes back and listens to that music, they'll see that Mitch Mitchell was really on fire and a wonderful, wonderful musician. Anyway, moving on. So by the 70s, powerful playing on the drums starts to be recorded properly. And going into the 80s, absolutely. Imagination, Rick James, there are tons and tons of funk bands and rock bands, and fusion starts to take hold. I should have mentioned that. Weather Report, right? I guess in the 70s, going into the 80s, there are a lot of fusion bands, and fusion music generally attracts the jazz drummer to play, and that brings along the defense of hearing all of our notes. And so fusion music of the 70s and the 80s and then today, all of the notes are being heard. And we went through a phenomenal experience in the 80s of really pristine, clear sounding fusion music. Of all musicians, it didn't seem to cater to just Weather Report. The Yellow Jackets, I wouldn't call Santana fusion music, but that was a very large ensemble, and they certainly were recorded in the same manner. The Meters, it's a great funk band. You could hear everything going on. Chick Corea and the Electric Band, right? Fusion music. There were a ton. I can't think of all of them right here, but when you go to fusion music, one of the things that you're going to experience, one of the things is clean, clear, well engineered, well recorded, well mixed drums. And as a drummer, it's a fabulous way to enjoy the instrument, because up until that time, the drums were very much in the back, uh, and uh, and were recorded, like I said, with maybe a bass drum mic and an overhead mic. Um, Putting aside the discussion of what jazz was, um, so even when you're talking about stuff like Johnny Cash and Elvis, the drums are still, although they were recording uh, closer in jazz settings, they still opted to record the drums and mix them, in any case, further away. Um, and that tends to be the case for pop music. So 80s pop, 90s pop, um, there's uh, an obvious decision you can see to keep the drums in the back, or at least not in the front. And so in pop music, let's talk about Michael Jackson, Madonna, uh, Tina Turner, Paul McCartney, pop music of the 80s. You get a sense of not hearing all of the drums going on, especially hi-hats. There was a quote, I believe it was when John J. Robinson was playing on stage at a concert. I forget which one he was doing, but Quincy Jones came up and told him, a young John J. Robinson, hey, nobody's here to hear your hi-hats. And John J. Robinson was like, he kind of looked up, was like, oh, okay. And because playing shuffles creates a lot of hi-hat work, and drummers are very proud of being able to do that, and they tend to want that to be heard, because that's kind of like the glue between the bass and the snare relationship. But when we're in pop music, or at least with that kind of perspective of engineering and mixing drums, hi-hats tend to be lost. They tend to be put very far behind the snare drum, behind the bass drum, behind the toms, behind the crashes, which in some ways is tragic, because as a drummer, you know that the hi-hats are an element that need to be heard to understand why everything is happening in the way it's happening. One of the bands that kind of bridged that gap and kept the hi-hats present was a band called The Police. And Stewart Copeland is very well known for having wonderful, wonderful hi-hat work. And that sound is present in all of the Police recordings. Wonderful hi-hat work. Now, that was already being present in big band and in jazz music. Buddy Rich, Max Roach, all these guys, Louis Bellson, in the 50s and the 60s. But as I said, hi-hat work in another style, pop, is not as present. So the Police kind of crossed the line with that, and hi-hats, I almost want to say that Stewart Copeland helped defend the notion of hearing hi-hats in popular mixes and popular engineering techniques. in engineering pop music. I almost want to say Stuart Copeland. Without Stuart Copeland and the Police, maybe that evolution would have been different. He was so it was so attractive what he was doing that sometimes you see albums where it just says hi-hats, Stuart Copeland. And I think that happens on some Peter Gabriel albums where there's Manu Katché or I don't know who else was playing with him, but Stuart Copeland would come in and do hi-hats. So that was fairly new. Like I said, a lot of that stuff, not just the hi-hats, but a lot of the drums were not present, not in front, not at least equal with the other instruments. So this carries on until the 90s, and drums are very, very present. Very present. The 90s, and I should say actually the 80s with rock bands, the drums take a position that is really equal in distance from your ear in the mix in the 80s, certainly in the 90s, but in the 80s. So you hear kind of a democracy of sound. Everybody's got their position and it's all coming at you at an equal distance, pretty much, with exceptions during mixing, but anyway. In the 90s, you almost want to say that drums start to take a step ahead of everybody in the mix. And so you get grunge music where drums are absolutely present and almost, like I said, in front of the other band members, the other instruments, extremely present. I mean, if we go back to Led Zeppelin, there might have been moments where they faded in or moved the drums closer to your ear than what do I want to say? There might have been little moments where they did that, but for the most part, you hear a very balanced and almost, and the drums are slightly behind Robert Plant's voice. So when Robert Plant's singing, you hear that there's like the stage. He's here and John Bonham's here. And you hear this. In rock in the 80s and then certainly in the 90s, it sounds at least at the same, if not a little further up the drums. Just trying to compare it to Led Zeppelin rock, there is a difference in sound. Drums definitely are more present. This carries on through the 2000s. And up until this point, we, as drummers in pop, rock, and fusion music, loud music, metal, progressive rock, you hear all the drums in Rush. I should have mentioned up here as well. That was in the 70s. So another one with Led Zeppelin, Hendrix, and the Who. So we're hearing all of the notes that these drummers are playing. All of them. It was okay. It was cool. Whereas before that, we didn't really have the notion of hearing everything. We felt like if we didn't listen enough, we would miss notes because they were so far in the back or faded down, like hi-hats, for example. But when you saw these bands play live, you go, oh wait, there is that part. He is playing those hi-hats. Well, what is he actually doing? He's not just playing eighth notes. He's playing shuffles, or this while the band's going on, and you don't even hear that in the recording. But when you see it live, you see he's doing it. That kind of stuff. So in the 90s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, early 2000s, we start to all that stuff is recorded in a way where we hear what they're doing. Hey, please mic the hi-hats. I want to hear that in the recording, right? And it starts to, you get a sense when you listen to music going into or passing the 2000s that the cup is starting to fill up right to the top. The notes that are being played and being heard, I should say, and recorded properly, and they're starting to fill up that cup right to the very top. And you notice when you do a comparison of recordings versus live performances of the same song, advancing through the 2000s, 2005, 10, 15, 25, you start to see an overflow of that cup of notes in the drum department being played. You start to see in pop music way more notes than you've ever heard before, than you've ever seen before in pop music or in rock music. Watching the live performance of a rock song or a pop song, and they cut to the drummer, you suddenly see a ton of hi-hat work, you suddenly see a ton of little splash work, all kinds of little stuff going on everywhere. And when you compare that song, that live performance, to the recording in the studio, what do you start to see? What do you start to hear? You start to hear a fading out of all of those notes. You start to, when you compare these two, you notice that the notes that I saw being played on stage of that rock song or that pop song or that metal song are not being heard in the recorded studio version. That's what starts to happen. I imagine the engineers and the singers and just the artistic director club of the band start saying, whoa, okay, you can play that stuff live, but in the recording, no, we can't have this just, circus of sound behind this pop song going on. Live, okay. But what also happens is because the drummers now are literally filling up the groove all over the place. Hi-hat work, splash work everywhere, tom work, bass drum work, snare work, just in the groove. We're not talking about a solo extension of the groove or anything like that. Just playing the pocket. Even in live recordings, when I watch a live show and you listen to the drummer playing and watching them play while you're listening, you notice that you're not hearing all of the notes that they're playing. And if you are, they are very, very low in the mix. I just got done seeing one this morning again. Drummer was going crazy. Hi-hat work, snare work, splash work, bass drum work. But what did you actually hear in the live performance? Cha, cha. That's what you heard. It's a very it's kind of a phenomenon again happening where the drummers are filling it up so much, and the engineers are definitely making the choice to fade those things out, letting them be free up on stage, but that is not what is needed in the song. And it's so much so that even in live recordings, in live performances, they fade down the hi-hats and boost up the bass drum and boost up the snare drum. So all of that other stuff is not coming to your ear with the same presence. You have the feeling like the bass drum and the snare drum are here, and the hi-hats, right, are way back here. And the bass drum, in some cases, is being faded out during heavy activity, you know. You're not hearing the drums in those pop songs and in those rock songs like you would in a fusion song. But that's how they're playing them in those live recordings that I see, in those live performances. So it's kind of funny because it's going like full circle. Back when the drums were very active, let's say swing band, and not being recorded, and what do you hear? With the hi-hats, right? That's, and maybe the bass drum, but all the other activity, the subtle ghost notes on the snare drum, you were not hearing. So there's a lot of that stuff going on, but it wasn't being presented properly in the mix. To now, to the 80s, I'm going very fast, to the 80s, where all of the notes are finally heard, to in the 2000s and then beyond, where there's way too many notes and the engineers are fading them out or putting them further back in the mix. It's a very funny circumstance going on with recording drums. And, years ago, I used to transcribe for a popular drum magazine in France, and I had something like 14 pages to do. I love notation and transcribing. I've been doing it since forever. One of the things you notice when you transcribe music, drumming of all different styles, is that there's a lot of notes that aren't necessary, actually. There are a lot of notes that these drummers are playing in these albums that aren't necessary to the transmission of the song. There are a ton of notes. That's good and bad. It's good because it's just fun to learn different parts, and drummers can talk about, it's the drummer jargon about, what rudiment or what polyrhythm or whatever's going on. But in the large picture, there's a lot of notes that don't need to be played. And, back when you were listening to Motown music or soul music, they definitely understood that. The most important notes, bass drum, snare drum, a little bit of the hi-hat, those notes you needed to make sure to have those in place, and not only mechanically in place, but they needed to breathe, and they needed to feel alive. And you couldn't hide behind a gazillion notes when you're playing an Otis Redding song. James Brown is a slight exception, but still in James Brown, you hear the distance of the drums being faded in during solo spots and faded out and put more in the back, even though there were a lot of notes. But as an exception, you needed to focus on the notes that really helped transmit the song. And as I said, there are a lot of notes being played today in pop music. Pop. I won't, it's almost mandatory that you play those notes and you hear them in metal and in progressive rock music and fusion music. And one could also say in funk, but in pop, there's still a gazillion notes that don't need to be played. And it's when you just look at keeping your energy, endurance, stamina in a pop song, it kind of doesn't make sense when you realize that the engineer's going to fade these notes out. In the studio recording, they're not going to be there anyway. So it doesn't make any sense to fill it up that much. And it actually becomes a distraction. And we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of it today. As opposed to Lionel Richie, as opposed to Sugarfoot and Michael Jackson. Those pop songs were played on the drums pretty much like a 70s funk drummer or a blues drummer, where every single note was heard. And so when you're listening to Michael Jackson or Lionel Richie, the drums are finely mic'd properly where everything is heard, and you almost are nervous playing that music because every single note has to count. Every single one. They didn't yet have the approach of, well, just play whatever you want and I'll fade it out, like they do today. That's pretty much what I'm seeing in live recordings. Whenever I see a live band, a pop band, sometimes rock, drummers are doing it now in rock too, but most of the time I see it in pop music or R&B music of today, drummers are playing a gazillion notes, and you're not hearing half of them because the engineers they're taking all those notes out of the performance. So if they're taking them all out, why would you play them anyway? You might say, well, it inspires me to play them. Okay, fine, but let's just be real here for a moment. We're not hearing those notes. In pop music and R&B music today, it's very funny. What is actually being heard? Boom, cha, boom, cha, boom, boom, cha, boom, boom, cha. This thing. And so, in a sense, the drummers are definitely there's more drummers, more advanced than there ever has been in history. But the engineers and the artistic directors are still conscious of the fact that all of those other notes do not serve the song. And we're going to fade them out. You can go play them, but we're fading them out. It's kind of funny to see. So, as a drummer in a cover band, I don't play all of those notes. And I guess I'm an old school guy. When I'm doing, I don't know, a Daft Punk song, or when I'm doing any kind of, an Eagles song, or a Beatles song, or a rock and roll song, or I'm definitely showing my age because I'm not playing the hits of today, but I've seen it done where people are playing those songs that I just referred to, those bands, and filling it up. I don't do that. My approach is pretty much like I grew up with, where every single note counts. And every single note I play, I want it heard, and it can't interfere with, I don't want anybody fading my notes out. So, as such, I have to pay very close attention to the notes I'm playing. It's pretty much like 60s, 70s, 80s perspective of the drums. I don't think that the drummers are seeing that we're not hearing all the notes they're playing. I think when they go back and hear that concert, they might go, you can't even hear that hi-hat work I was doing. And I had a great bass drum fill right there. You didn't even hear that. It's very, very interesting what's going on in the drumming community. Kind of under the radar. Again, stuff that nobody's talking about, but that I see. And I think a lot of other people will catch on to. And once these kids and older guys they're doing the same thing, filling it up, but actually in the presentation of the performance, you don't hear any of it. They might start get wind to this and say, what's the point? So more news soon. I thought that was kind of an interesting, delicate conversation, but interesting nonetheless. And there's always more on the way. Thanks for following. Ciao.